This is Democracy Watch. So, Mark, we've got some news on the South Carolina congressional map. Can you speak on what we're waiting for at the Supreme Court?
Okay, let me first say this is an absolute outrage. I mean, this is an outrage. What we're waiting on is a decision from the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that was argued in October of last year, in which both of the parties, the state and the plaintiffs who brought the case, in a racial gerrymander case. Okay, this involves a claim of intentional discrimination against Black voters of South Carolina in the way in which Nancy Mace's district was reconfigured after the last round of her district. And both the state of South Carolina and the plaintiffs, the Black voters who are discriminated here, said to the Supreme Court, hey, we need an answer by January 1st. Okay, that's what they said. That's not an unreasonable thing to ask for. Here we are, they still don't have an answer. And in the meantime, the state of South Carolina has now gone back to the U.S. Supreme Court and said, oh, by the way, we need permission to go ahead and use the existing map, which is the map that had been struck down at the court below for being racially gerrymandered, for discriminating against Black voters. And South Carolina wants to use that map again and make the Black voters of that district suffer the indignity of having to go to the polls for a second time under a map that already a federal court of appeals panel has said, federal trial court panel has said, is unconstitutional, violates their constitutional rights. Where the hell is the Supreme Court in putting an end to this?
And so at what point are they going to say, well, now it's too close to the election, and so the Purcell doctrine comes into effect, and we don't want to do anything that's going to impact the imminent election here?
Oh, you know it. I mean, you know it. You know where this is going. Where this is going is South Carolina is going to say, look, it's too late. It's too late now for us to have a new map. We told you it had to be by January. And the Supreme Court, which caused this problem, there's no reason the Supreme Court couldn't have ruled on this case in 3 months.
Right.
When the Supreme Court wanted to make sure that that Donald Trump was on the Colorado ballot, they managed to rule that case fast enough.
Yeah.
They managed to get that case out. In fact, the bitter irony is people thought that the Supreme Court might rule. It might be the South Carolina case that they were going to rule on that day, where they called that emergency session to issue a ruling on a day they don't normally issue decisions, because maybe they felt time pressure. No, wasn't for that case. They felt time pressure to make sure that Donald Trump and Republicans didn't have any concerns that he wouldn't be on the ballot when the Colorado primary election was that day.
Right. They can call an emergency session to directly contradict the plain text of the Constitution in blind deference to Donald Trump, but not to make sure that illegal maps are rectified in time for the next election.
Right.
Mark,
So everyone out there, no one should have confidence that what you just said, Brian, is not going to happen. Or put it another way, what you just said is going to happen, which they're going to say it's just too late. However we rule, it's too late. It's not for 2024. Sorry, maybe 2026.
Well, how likely is it that their request for a stay is going to be granted?
Look, I think South Carolina is going to get what they want. And I think they're going to get what they want for two reasons. First of all, like I said, South Carolina is going to say, we were not the problem here, right? You can't say we caused this delay. We jointly with the plaintiffs said, if we have a decision by January 1st, we have enough time to implement it. So they'll point to that. But the second is South Carolina will win because I don't have any confidence, and I don't think you do, that the Supreme Court has been sitting on this case because they want to give Black voters a victory. I don't think that they are sitting on this case because they want to make sure that there are fair maps in place in South Carolina in 2024.
Well, if their request is denied, could the Supreme Court still rule in Republicans' favor and allow the illegal map to be used?
Sure. Supreme Court can do what it wants.
Yeah.
And I think that we are probably going to see the Supreme Court, at least for 2024, allow this South Carolina map to go into effect. I hope I'm wrong. I hope in a few days or weeks we come back and it turns out the Supreme Court turned down South Carolina's request, and that they also ruled on the merits, that the map gets struck down, that the new remedial map is in place. Nancy Mace's district is no longer a racial gerrymander. especially since she has pivoted. So, this is the other thing. We talk a lot about the law, you and I, and about these cases, but just think about the real world consequences for those black voters. Not only did they get shuffled around based on their race in order to make Nancy Mace's district have fewer black voters, but what have the remaining black voters in that district gotten for it? They've gotten a representative in Nancy Mace who has turned from being, at least sometimes feigning to be a moderate, to now being a cheerleader for Donald Trump and the MAGA extremists. I mean, it's just the real, people can't ignore the real world consequences that these court cases have to everyday Americans who expect the courts to be protecting them from these kinds of things.
Is there any precedent here, regardless of when the Supreme Court might rule? They eventually will. Is there any precedent that might suggest how they're going to rule on this case?
Look, the Supreme Court should rule in favor of the black voters here. I've had the pleasure in my life of appearing 4 times for the Supreme Court, won all 4. All 4 were racial gerrymandering claims that involved black voters being moved or categorized in how lines were drawn. They were all redistricting cases, and the Supreme Court was pretty across the board in those cases. You can go back and look at any of those, and you can see that it was not just liberal justices, it was not just conservative justices. It was a pretty broad swath, and that's because if you think about it, Brian, where is the ideological force right now in this country to say we shouldn't categorize people based on race and enact state policy based on it? It's actually coming from the conservatives, right? So traditionally, racial gerrymandering claims were claims that conservative justices were very, very loath to rule in favor of the state. They were very suspicious of the use of race. So I'm very alarmed. I'm very concerned, and I'm frustrated by how long it has taken the Supreme Court to rule, and whether that means that the Supreme Court is going to abandon that position only in this one area, only when it comes to protecting black voters from unconstitutional districts.
Well, we've spoken a lot in this series about Alabama's congressional map, for example, and how that case ended with a fair map. How does that case differ from this one in South Carolina?
Well, I want to start by one striking similarity, which is, remember, my team, which litigated that Alabama case, we won that in time for 2022. Yeah, we won Louisiana in time for 2022.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court put a hold on everything for 2022. And it was only that citing Purcell's too close to the elections, and it was then afterwards that we've now gotten relief for 2024. So, the delay tactic is something that Republicans have used time and time again across cases and across maps. There are different cases in that the Alabama case and Louisiana case were Section 2 cases. They claimed that the state failed to create black opportunity districts where they were required to. Here in South Carolina, it's actually quite different. What they did is they basically moved black people out of Nancy Mace's district because she didn't want black voters in her district.
Yeah.
Because she wanted it to be more reliably Republican. Because maybe she wanted to go more MAGA. and here she is.
Yeah. To that point, Marc had mentioned that he represented the plaintiffs in that Louisiana and Alabama case. For those who are looking to support the work, the invaluable work that Marc and his team do, please sign up for Democracy Docket. It's the free news outlet Marc founded to focus on everything voting and elections. I'll put the link on this screen and also in the post description of this video. It's an amazing resource. I use it on a daily basis. Marc, what other maps to that point are currently being litigated ahead of 2024?
So there are still cases in a number of important states. The Florida Supreme Court is still hearing a case involving that state's congressional map.
And that's the 5th congressional district, right?
Correct. And that is another example of a district that had been represented by a black member of Congress, a historically black district that Ron DeSantis just decided he wanted to do away with in violation of the state constitution. Just said, I'm going to do away with it, notwithstanding the fact state constitution clearly says it can't. So my team is litigating that case, and that's very important. There's actually a case in Utah that we're not litigating, but which Democracy Docket tracks carefully, over whether that state's congressional district violates the state's constitution. It's an interesting case, and I wish them luck. And then, of course, we have a number of cases that are in various stages of the appellate process. You know, Brad Raffensperger in Georgia is appealing a case in Georgia that he lost, that my team won, claiming that there's no private right of action under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which would literally gut the remaining provisions of the Voting Rights Act. You know, so much for moderate Republicans in Georgia.
Right. And just for posterity here, which maps have been updated with the help of either your team or other firms that were representing the plaintiffs in those cases ahead of 2024?
Alabama, Louisiana, which we mentioned, Georgia, which I just mentioned, Brad Raffensperger is appealing, and of course New York, which, you know, was a big victory to have there be a redrawn map.
And of course, for those watching right now, to support the work that Marc and his team do, again, the best way to do that is to sign up for Democracy Docket. Again, I'll put the link right here on the screen and in the post description of this video. I'm sure that we're going to see more of these cases litigated, especially ahead of 2024 and as we move on into the future. So again, the best way to find out about that stuff is either watching right here or finding out on Democracy Docket. With that said, I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.